In part 1, we established the human sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation are three distinct variables, and that roughly 1% of the population, just under 1% of adults, by the best survey estimates, identifies as transgender. Now we zoom in on that population because if you turn on the news, you could be forgiven for thinking transgender people are everywhere, dominating women's sports, filling locker rooms, reshaping civilization. Let's put the noise aside and walk through what the peer-reviewed science says. Our backbone source is a critical review published in the American Journal of Psychiatry by Mueller, Cuypere T'Sjoen of Ghent University in Belgium. And along the way, we'll tackle the elephant in the stadium, the transgender athletes' controversy with the real numbers. We'll even evaluate astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson's proposal to abolish gender categories in sport and sort athletes by hormone levels instead. By the end, I hope you'll agree on one thing. Whatever your politics, the evidence points in a clear direction about what happens to human beings when we ignore, deny, or suppress their gender identity. And that direction is measured in depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. First, one more piece of vocabulary. Gender dysphoria is the psychological distress caused by identifying with a sex other than the one assigned at birth. Notice the word distress. Not everyone who is gender non-conforming is distressed by it. But for many, the mismatch between inner identity and body, amplified by legal, social, family, and workplace consequences, produces serious suffering. And here is an important point the review's authors make. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health has been working to de-psychopathologize being transgender. Being trans is increasingly understood as an identity, not a mental illness. What is treated medically is the dysphoria, the distress, as we'll see, the mountain of psychiatric problems that pile up when the distress goes unaddressed. The medical pathways include cross-sex hormone treatment, estrogen for trans women and testosterone for trans men, and gender-affirming surgery. Now, prevalence, and here we need to be careful because this is where public discussion most often garbles the numbers. As we saw in part 1, it depends entirely on what you measure. A meta-analysis by Arcelus and colleagues, counting only people who presented at gender clinics, put clinical prevalence at roughly 4.6 per 100,000. But when the Williams Institute used population surveys, simply asking people how they identify themselves, the figure came out to 0.6% of adults in their 2016 estimate, revised to 0.8% of adults and 1% of everyone 13 and up in 2025. So, clinic counts give you a rounding error. Population survey give you just under 1 in 100. Remember that number. It returns when we talk about sports. Meanwhile, the number of people presenting at gender clinics has risen steeply across Western countries since 2000. And broader LGBTQ plus identification, the whole umbrella, mind you, not trans identification specifically, has nearly tripled from 3.5% in 2012 to 9% in Gallup's poll in 2025. Why the rise? The review's authors suggest greater societal openness, legislative change, more affirming attitudes from doctors and media, and social media giving people vocabulary and courage. People aren't necessarily becoming transgender more often, they're becoming more visible. There is a direct correlation between acceptance levels in a region and the number of people willing to say who they are. Whether acceptance amplifies underlying rates rather than just disclosure rates is purely speculative. And there is a lovely historical precedent suggesting it doesn't. Left-handedness. In the early 20th century, teachers stopped forcibly retraining left-handed children, and the recorded rate of left-handedness promptly quadrupled, then plateaued at 10 to 12% of the population, where it has sat ever since. Removing the social penalty didn't create left-handers, it revealed them. The generational gradient we saw in Part 1, 23% of Gen Z under the LGBTQ plus umbrella versus 3% of retirees, looks a great deal like the steep part of that curve. One more biological footnote worth recording. The review finds that genetic disorders of steroid hormone synthesis, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, androgen insensitivity, the intersex conditions from Part 1, do not explain gender dysphoria. People with those conditions generally don't meet the diagnostic threshold for it. So this is not a simple hormone production glitch. It's something deeper. And we'll get to the brain shortly. Now for the heart of the matter, mental health. A large European study led by Halens assessed 305 transgender persons across 4 countries. At assessment, 38% had a current psychiatric diagnosis, mostly depression and other affective disorders at 27%, anxiety at 17%. The lifetime numbers are starker. 70% have experienced a psychiatric disorder at some point, 60% an affective disorder, 28% anxiety. Compare that with general population lifetime rates, which sit far lower, and you begin to grasp the scale. And these elevated rates survive careful methodology. A Swedish cohort study by Dane and colleagues matched trans persons with cisgender controls on age and natal sex. The elevated psychiatric burden remained. Now I need you to really hear this next section, because this is where the stakes become life and death. Rates of lifetime suicidality, thoughts and attempts, among transgender persons range from 30 to 81% across studies. For comparison, lifetime prevalence of suicide attempts in the overall U.S. population is about 4.6%. The National Transgender Discrimination Survey found 41% of trans respondents had attempted suicide. 41%, roughly double the rate in the lesbian, gay, and bisexual community, and nearly 9 times in the general population. Non-suicidal self-injury is estimated at 38% of the trans population before transition, and notably higher in trans men, nearly 58% in one study. These behaviors appear in children and adolescents with gender dysphoria too. The suffering spans the lifespan. And what predicts suicide in this population? The review lists the factors: a history of maltreatment, gender victimization, depression, substance abuse, young age. Read that list again: maltreatment, victimization. These are not things that come from within a person. They are things done to a person. Long-term data reinforce the concern. A Dutch study following over 1,300 trans persons for a median of 18 and a half years found mortality among trans women 51% above the general population, suicide among the leading causes. Even after transition, the Swedish cohort showed suicide rates well above baseline. The message is unambiguous. Transition helps. We'll see that evidence next, but it is not a magic wand, especially when a person transitions into a society that continues to reject them, which is precisely why the review recommends longitudinal monitoring before, during, and after transition. So, is there any good news? Yes, it matters. Emerging longitudinal research, the strongest evidence available here, shows significant reductions in psychopathology after transition, in some cases down to levels resembling the general population. In a longitudinal study of 107 transgender persons by Colisi and colleagues, 12 months of cross-sex hormone treatment produced significant reductions in anxiety, depression, psychoticism, global symptom severity, and functional impairment. Another study by Fisher and colleagues in Italy followed patients across 4 time points over 2 years. hormone treatment was associated with significant reductions in overall psychopathology, depressive symptoms, body uneasiness, and, critically, gender dysphoria itself, in both trans men and trans women. Consider what that means. Psychiatry rarely gets interventions that move the needle on this many outcomes simultaneously. Here is one. Allowing people to align their bodies with their identity measurably reduces their suffering. Now the honest caveats, because this is science, not advocacy. There have been no randomized controlled trials of hormone treatment for obvious ethical and practical reasons. You cannot assign someone a placebo identity. Suicidality does not necessarily normalize after transition. Sample sizes, while growing, remain modest. The review's authors are appropriately careful about all of it, but the direction of the evidence is consistent. Affirmation and treatment reduce pathology. Denial and rejection are associated with more of it. Which brings us to the social evidence. A massive European Union survey of over 93,000 LGBT people, nearly 7,000 of them trans, found 46% of trans persons reporting discrimination or harassment in the previous 12 months because they were perceived as trans, 30% while job hunting, 23% at work. In a study of American LGBT youth age 16 to 20, victimization and low social support prospectively predicted suicidal ideation. Self-harm was associated with childhood gender nonconformity, hopelessness, and again, victimization. The pattern is what researchers call minority stress. The psychiatric burden tracks the hostility of the environment. Where acceptance is higher, suffering is lower. Research even suggests that post-transition appearance, how well they pass for the person that they want to be, correlates with well-being, which again points to the social mirror. How the world treats you shapes your mind. There's also intriguing research on differences within the trans population. Smith and colleagues studied 187 trans persons after gender-affirming surgery and found meaningful subtypes. Those attracted to their birth sex, for instance, trans women attracted to men, tended to report dysphoria earlier in childhood, transitioned younger, and often had appearance ratings more compatible with their identified gender. Others say trans women attracted to women often transitioned later, sometimes after marrying and having children. Different life paths, different clinical needs. One size does not fit all, and good medicine knows it. Notice incidentally how this echoes part 1. Orientation and gender identity are independent axes even within the trans population itself. And one Italian study found that even as hormone treatment reduced depression and dysphoria, patients' distress about social and legal obstacles actually increased, particularly for trans men. The medicine was working. Society was generating suffering faster than the clinic could relieve it. When we look at the risk factors, discrimination, harassment, victimization, family rejection, these are modifiable. Society is not a bystander to this epidemic of suffering. Society is a variable in the equation. Now the neurobiology. Is there something different about the transgender brain? The honest headline: no single so-called transgender center has been found. But there are intriguing clues. A post-mortem histological study by Garcia, Falgueras, and Swab examined 42 brains focusing on a tiny hypothalamic structure, the INAH-3 subregion of the uncinate nucleus, which differs in size between men and women. In 10 transgender women, this nucleus was female-sized, consistent with their identity, not their birth sex. Critically, this wasn't an artifact of hormone therapy or castration because non-trans castrated men didn't show that pattern. An earlier and equally famous study by Zhao and colleagues, published in Nature, found the same identity-consistent pattern in another structure, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Whole brain structural MRI is murkier. Gray matter in untreated trans persons mostly resembles birth sex. Some subcortical structures give conflicting results. White matter studies using diffusion imaging tend to show an intermediate phenotype. Trans persons falling between cisgender men and women on sexually dimorphic tracts. Those studies disagree on details. The functional evidence is where it gets genuinely interesting. Humans respond to certain steroid odor compounds in sex-differentiated ways. Androstenedione activates the hypothalamus differently in women than in men. Berglund and colleagues found transgender women's hypothalamic responses resembled cisgender women's and differed from cisgender men's. Burke and colleagues replicate this in adolescents with gender dysphoria. Similar findings come from voice perception. Junger and colleagues found that transgender women's brain activation when hearing gender-morphed voices looked more like cisgender women's. In mental rotation, a spatial task that on average favors males, trans women showed parietal activation patterns less like cisgender men. And in one study, this appeared before any hormone treatment, so the medication didn't create it. In verbal fluency, adolescent trans girls in one study outproduced all other groups, with activation intermediate between cisgender boys and girls. And the adult brain proves remarkably plastic under treatment. Hypothalamic volume decreasing in trans women on estrogen, increasing in trans men on testosterone, cortical thickness shifting towards the identified sex, even ventricle changing size. The authors were refreshingly candid about the limits. Most imaging studies involve 10 to 25 trans participants per group, small numbers for detecting an intermediate phenotype, which by definition sits between two comparison groups. Some studies lack pretreatment baseline. There are no randomized trials. There is a striking absence of research on emotional processing, surprising given how central affective disorders are, and the paucity of adolescent data. That's why multi-center initiatives like the European Network for Investigation of Gender Incongruence, pooling clinics across Norway, Germany, Belgium, and Netherlands, matter a lot. They are building the sample size the field has lacked. So, the fair summary. Depending on the region, the trans brain looks partly like the birth sex and partly intermediate, and in some specific structures and functions, like the experienced gender. But the takeaway for public debate is this: gender identity has measurable biological correlates. This is not a whim, a fad, or a choice in the trivial sense. Something real is happening in these brains, and it was happening long before anyone filled out a form at a clinic. All right, now for the topic that consumes 1,000 times more time than everything. I've just told you, transgender athletes. Based on media coverage and legislative energy, you might guess trans athletes are a mass phenomenon. Let's look at the actual number. In December 2024, NCAA President Charlie Baker testified under oath before the U.S. Senate. Asked how many athletes compete in NCAA schools, he answered, 510,000. Asked how many transgender athletes he was aware of, fewer than 10. Fewer than 10 out of 500,000? Less than 0.02%, roughly 1 in 50,000 college athletes. Meanwhile, since 2020, roughly half of the United States have passed laws restricting trans youth from school sports. Entire legislative sessions dedicated to fewer than 10 college athletes. Recall the number from Part 1. Trans people are about 1% of the population, but at the elite level, 0.02% of athletes. The moral panic outnumbers the athletes. The Olympics are even starker. Openly transgender athletes have technically been allowed to compete since 2004. It took 17 years before a single one did. At Tokyo in 2021, weightlifter Laurel Hubbard of New Zealand became the first and, to date, only openly transgender woman ever to compete at the Games. She was 43, and she was eliminated without a medal. Canadian soccer player Quinn, transgender and non-binary, won gold for Canada, but as someone assigned female at birth, playing women's soccer, hardly the scenario the controversy imagines. No openly trans woman has ever won an Olympic medal. None competed at Paris 2024. The famous cases fit on one hand. Leah Thomas, the Penn swimmer who won a single NCAA title in 2022, and, worth noting, tied for fifth in another event with Riley Gaines, who became her most prominent critic. Cece Telfer, a Division II hurdler who won a national title in 2019. More recently, San Jose State volleyball player Blair Fleming. A running tally by Outsports of every publicly known trans college athlete in history, all genders, all divisions, all sports, reached only a few dozen names. Now, fairness to the other side, because the concern isn't frivolous, studies, including work in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, suggest trans women who went through male puberty can retain some athletic advantages even after a year of hormone therapy, particularly in some measures of strength. Women fought for a century to have their own protected competitive category, and preserving fairness in elite women's sport is a legitimate scientific and policy question. Reasonable people, including some LGBT athletes like Martina Navratilova, disagree about where to draw the lines. But here is my point. This is a genuinely hard-edged case affecting a vanishingly small number of elite competitors, being used as the public face of an entire population of millions, the overwhelming majority of whom will never compete in anything more serious than a company softball game. When policy aimed at fewer than 10 NCAA athletes sends a message of rejection to every trans teenager in the country, remember the adolescent self-harm statistics, the cost-benefit calculation deserves scrutiny. Which brings us to Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist who waded into this debate reportedly on Piers Morgan, on podcasts, and in a recurring sparring match with Bill Maher. His proposal? This is a frontier problem to be solved, so perhaps we stop competing by gender altogether and compete by hormone levels instead. Sort athletes the way wrestling sorts by weight. Measure testosterone, create divisions, let biology rather than identity define the bracket. What to make of it? Let me give both sides because it deserves a serious answer. The appeal is real. It attempts to replace an increasingly contested social category with an objective measurable biomarker. Testosterone genuinely is the single most important driver of male athletic advantage. It's why the entire anti-doping apparatus polices it. Tyson is essentially saying, we already regulate this molecule, why not organize competitions around it? It's creative, it's science-flavored, and it treats the problem as engineering rather than culture. But the proposal breaks down for at least 4 reasons. First, legacy effect. Much of the male advantage is built during puberty and then persists. Height, larger hearts and lungs, bone density, hand size. A trans woman who suppresses testosterone today still carries the skeleton testosterone built at 16. A hormone snapshot misses the developmental history entirely. Second, within-sex testosterone correlates surprisingly poorly with performance. Among elite men, the highest testosterone athlete is not reliably the best one. Hormone divisions would scramble competitors in ways that don't track ability. Third, perverse incentives. Define divisions by hormone level and you've created a reason to chemically manipulate that level. The exact behavior anti-doping exists to prevent, while natural fluctuations makes enforcement a nightmare. Fourth, the irony under a strict hormone rule. Women with naturally high testosterone, like 2-time Olympic and 3-time world champion middle distance runner Caster Semenya, get pushed out of the female category or pressured into medication to lower their natural hormones, which has already happened under the World Athletics rules and has been widely criticized as its own injustice. Verdict? Tyson deserves credit for lowering the temperature and thinking mechanistically, and his deeper instinct, that sport already tolerates enormous natural advantages and that categories are human inventions we can redesign is worth taking seriously, but hormone level alone are too crude of an instrument. The more workable path is what federations are actually doing, sport by sport policies, because the physics of shot put and the physics of equestrian are not the same. Open or additional categories where feasible, and above all, distinction between elite competition, where fairness stakes are real, and school and recreational sport, where the purpose is health, belonging, and joy, and where exclusion does documented psychological damage to a population already carrying a 41% suicide rate attempt. So let's assemble the full picture, both parts of this journey. Human sexuality and gender are multidimensional. Sex is bimodal, not binary. Orientation is a spectrum whose largest minority is bisexual, and gender identity is a distinct axis that diverges from birth sex in just under 1% of adults. A small percentage, but tens of millions of humans being worldwide. That identity has measurable neurobiological correlates. This is not a trend or histrionics. Transgender people carry a devastating burden of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidality. Attempts rate up to 9 times the general population, and the burden is driven substantially by external modifiable factors: discrimination, harassment, victimization, rejection. The pathology tracks the hostility of the environment. Gender-affirming treatment measurably reduces depression, anxiety, body distress, and dysphoria itself in longitudinal studies, one of the clearer treatment signals in this corner of psychiatry, and ignoring or suppressing gender identity does not make it go away. It shows up instead in psychiatric wards, self-injury, statistics, and mortality tables. There is a role for clinicians, and the review spells it out. Because being trans is increasingly recognized as an identity rather than a disorder, a clinician's job is shifting, not gatekeeping identity, but diagnosing and treating the depression, anxiety, and suicidality that so often accompany dysphoria, distinguishing genuine gender dysphoria from conditions that can masquerade as it, and staying with the patient through the entire journey. Transgender care at its best is a whole team effort. Endocrinologists, surgeons, voice therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists. Because a human being is not just a body, it's not just a mind, but both, and a life lived among other people. I will leave you with this. Psychiatry spent much of the 20th century treating homosexuality as a disease. We now recognize that the disease was never in the patients. It was in how they were treated. The evidence suggests we are living through the same lesson again, this time with gender. The numbers are on the table: 70% lifetime psychiatric disorder, 41% suicide attempts, and measurable relief when identity is affirmed and care is given. Science can't tell us what to value, but it can tell us the consequences of our choices. And on this question, the consequences could not be clearer.